Welcome back to the Contrary podcast. Believe it or not, there was once a time not that long ago, maybe like 5 minutes ago, no, a little bit longer, when Republicans and conservatives said they believed in free markets, fiscal responsibility, and were opposed to government picking the winners and losers of the economy. And that, my friends, now seems like a distant memory because Donald Trump has unilaterally imposed hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes, and he picks winners and losers through fear and favor. And after insisting over and over and over again that American businesses and consumers would not pay the tariffs, that China and other foreign countries would eat them, Donald Trump is now attacking companies like Walmart for saying, yeah, the tariffs are in fact going to lead to higher prices. So the leader of the formerly free market party is also now lecturing Americans about the number of dolls and the number of pencils they need and criticizing companies for wanting to make a profit. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's Doge spectacularly failed to find deep cuts in government spending, and congressional Republicans seem poised to pass a budget that will blow a $4 to $5 trillion hole in the national debt while doing pretty much nothing, little to actually grow the economy. Last week, Moody's downgraded America's perfect credit score and once again cited the profound unseriousness of attempts to rein it in. And one of the people who has been consistently and intelligently writing and talking about this for years is our guest today, Jessica Riedl, who is, can I just read your bio? First of all, hello to a fellow cheesehead, Jessica.
Go Packers.
Yeah, we go way back in Wisconsin politics, and unfortunately know some of the same people. So I have a question to ask you about them. You
Yeah.
know,
Fair
yeah, I
enough.
know. Well, just to give your credentials here, you're a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where you focus on budget, tax, and economic policy. You worked in the United States Senate. You spent a decade at the Heritage Foundation as the lead research fellow on federal budget and spending. And Washingtonian Magazine named you as one of the 500 most influential policy professionals in Washington, D.C., including one of the 26 most influential within economic policy in recent years. But let me just read some of the headlines of your recent writing for people going, okay, as you know, she comes from that world. The 10 worst Republican budget gimmicks. Trump's tariffs are incoherent and destructive. Congressional Republicans might set off the debt bomb. Or how about this one? I'm a conservative economist. Here are 6 reasons Trump's plans won't work. Despite faux fanfare and outrage, Doge hasn't even scratched the federal budget monster. And then in The Atlantic, a couple of weeks ago, the actual math behind Doge's cuts, which did not add up. So, Jessica, I guess the first question is, did you change or did they change?
Well, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, I did not leave the Republican Party. The Republican Party left me. I was a good down the line Republican for many years. In fact, when I was in college in Wisconsin, I was the state chairman of the college Republicans. I worked for Republican presidential candidates, Republican senators. The problem, of course, is if you're a traditional conservative Reaganite who believes in low taxes, deficit reduction, free trade, free markets, and strong defense, and opposing the Soviet Union, you have seen the Republican Party become the opposite of what you used to stand for. It is a populist, big government party that is big spending, big tariffs, no free markets. It's very much supporting the Soviet Union, essentially,
Yes.
in Ukraine. And I don't know what happened to the party I used to support, but it's distressing. It's left me homeless.
I mean, it's one thing on the social issues, to see what's happened to the party, but on the economics, I remember right after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I was talking to George Will about all of this, and we were thinking, what happened to that economically conservative party, and he said something along the lines of, it turns out we were a much smaller band of brothers and sisters than we thought we were, that maybe that belief in free markets and freedom and restraint in government was really sort of like a very, very thin pie crust over something very, very different. Because to watch the Republican president of the United States impose these massive new tariffs, these massive new taxes, and then lecturing Americans about the number of dolls and pencils they have, and then attacking companies like Walmart for daring to suggest that, taxes lead to higher prices. It strikes me as like, how did the Republican Party nominate and elect a neo-Marxist president? Which is a little extreme, but that's not the kind of rhetoric you ever would have expected from a Mitt Romney, Ronald Reagan, even the Bushes.
I think during the Tea Party era, there was this view that, wow, Republicans have really become free market, spending cut libertarians. And it turns
Yes.
out that, as I believe Tom Massey said later, the voters weren't libertarians. They were just voting for the craziest bastard they could find. And, I think what happened was Paul Ryan took the free market, spending cut, deficit reduction rhetoric seriously and charged up the hill on this stuff and turned around to find no army behind him. When Trump was elected in 2016, a poll by Gallup showed that only 10% of Republicans believed in Social Security reform and only 15% of Republicans believed in Medicare reform. So ultimately, what Trump exploited was that the Republicans, their fiscal conservatism was very specific. It was, don't give bailouts to Wall Street, don't do Obamacare, don't give money to foreign aid. It wasn't at all about the programs they like. And Trump not only exploited that, but he has since made the Republican Party even more populist by chasing out the free marketers and bringing in more populists. And ultimately, I think, we're kind of left without a free market party these days.
No, it does feel that way. So let's talk about your most recent piece on Doge, because I think that this is, but before we move on to other things in American politics, the defenestration of Elon Musk is rather extraordinary. We have a big story in Politico about how he's really not very visible anymore. Trump isn't talking about him anymore. He's kind of absent. Not to suggest that he has not done a lot of damage or is still not influential, but let's just talk about the Doge cuts, because that seemed to dominate the news for months. You had him posing on the stage with the chainsaw and everything, and every day we got news stories of the various cuts. So he promised in the beginning that he was going to eliminate $2 trillion of the $7 trillion federal budget. In the end, do you have a sense of how much he actually saved?
Thus far, it has been about $2 to $3 billion a month, which is per month 1/35th of 1% of the federal budget. Originally, it was going to be 2 trillion, then 1 trillion, then $150 billion. I've gone through not only the Doge wall of receipts, but also the monthly treasury statements on how much was spent. And the only real change we've seen is that public health spending has dropped about $1 billion a month, from 8 billion to 7 billion. That's NIH, CDC. And foreign aid has dropped from about 2.5 billion a month to 1.5 billion a month. Ultimately, Doge is maybe gonna, by the time it's done, save far less than 1% of federal spending. And I think the reason it failed is because it went for government spending cut theater. 75% of all the budget goes to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, veterans, and interest. But instead of going where the money is, Doge focused on political pro subscriptions, DEI contracts, government workers, foreigners, immigrants. Those are
Shiny
targets
objects
that really excite MAGA. But that's not where the money is. And ultimately, going for the headlines instead of doing the real work is why it's government spending cut theater.
Well, you wrote something very interesting in your Atlantic article. Having said that his evaluated as an attempt to cut government spending, Doge was wholly unserious. But you conclude none of this is to say the Doge has failed. Musk might not have followed through on his unfocused and evolving promises to eliminate payment errors, balance the entire budget, and implement regulatory reform, but he has successfully given the White House cover to purge and intimidate the civil service, helped Congress justify exorbitant tax cuts, rewarded MAGA voters with revenge against their perceived enemies, and granted himself the ability to access sensitive government data and possibly ensure his company's continued government contracts. Sure, annual budget deficits remain on track to double over the next decade, but if you thought that Doge was really about cutting costs, you were never in on the joke. So he did accomplish a lot of things, but it wasn't about cutting the budget.
It wasn't about cutting the budget, and that's why I don't think Doge is seen as a failure on the right. I mean, of course,
Mm-hmm.
budget deficits are still on track to double over the next decade from 1.8 trillion to 4 trillion, but Congress has much fewer distractions cutting taxes. In fact, I read an interview with a prominent Republican senator today who said that we can afford to cut taxes by $5 trillion because of all the great work Doge is doing. Of course, Doge is ultimately probably going to lose money when you take into account the fired IRS agents not being able to collect revenue. But it gave Republicans this talking point that now we can cut taxes. It's really just kind of a distraction and cover for doing what they were going to do anyway.
Well, speaking of cutting taxes, on Friday, Moody's became the correct me if I'm wrong on this, the last of the major credit agencies to downgrade the credit of the United States. And so, you give me your sense. I mean, others have done this in the past, but they seem very pointed in pointing the finger and saying this has been a consistent failure by both parties to control the deficit and the debt. And then they seem to target both Doge and this one big beautiful budget bill, suggesting that this was not going to fix the problem; it was going to make it worse. So, does it matter? Give me your take on the decision by Moody's to downgrade the credit rating.
Yeah, the ratings agencies did a downgrade around 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
But that was more of a temporary downgrade because the deficit had soared so much during the Great Recession and with the Obama stimulus. And once the deficit kind of moved out of that rough patch, they restored our AAA credit rating.
Yeah.
What's happening now is worse because it's not based on temporary factors. It's based on structural budget deficits that, as I mentioned earlier, are on pace to double again over the next decade. And Congress's inability to strike a deal to reduce deficits or really even stop growing them with big tax cuts and spending hikes.
Yeah.
So I don't see the path for what's going to reverse the downgrade because I don't see Congress changing its behavior. And ultimately, this is very dangerous for the federal government because interest costs are going to bury us and interest rates are going to bury us. I did a big thread today on X about how right now the 10-year bond is at 4.5%.
4.5.
Well, we have a federal budget that's basically based on the idea that interest rates can never rise above 4% ever again without a debt crisis. If our bond gets downgraded, the risk premium goes up. Companies who borrow money want more protection against the default risk, and that ends up costing hundreds of billions of dollars in interest payments. Interest in 2023 surpassed Medicaid, in 2024 surpassed defense, and this year is surpassing Medicare to become the second biggest item in the budget after Social Security. This downgrade is not going to help.
Okay, so the downgrade actually matters, but let's talk about this because there's a school of thought that says the deficits don't matter. Nobody cares about deficits. You and I have been hearing warnings about the debt crisis. The debt crisis is imminent. The debt crisis is looming. It hasn't come yet. So talk to me about that, about this as a real threat, because I think that most Americans and certainly most policymakers are thinking that's a problem I don't need to worry about because it's in the distant future. So, what's going to happen and how will we know it's here, I guess is what I'm
Right. Well, we've heard warnings of a debt crisis before, but the warnings, if you go back and read the Social Security trustees report, the Medicare trustees report, it's not that a debt crisis was imminent in the 1990s and 2000s. It wasn't. The debt was about 40% of GDP. The warning was now's the time to fix the budget. Now is the time to fix Social Security and Medicare while the baby boomers were young enough to absorb the savings. And what they had said at the time is if you don't fix it, Then in the 2020s and 2030s, when all the baby boomers have retired into Social Security and Medicare, that's when you're going to see the crisis. Well, that's where we are right now. The deficit's 1.8 trillion. But really, the number that matters is the debt as a share of the economy. Think of it like your mortgage as a share of your income.
Yeah.
The debt as a share of was 106% of the economy at the end of World War II. Thankfully, it dropped to about 40% of the economy until 2008, when it's since spiked back to 100. That's the danger. We've gone from 40% of the economy to 100%. And over the next 30 years, it could go to 200 to 300% of the economy. Other countries in the world don't have debt going nearly that high. Europe has debt crises in Greece and elsewhere when the debt's 130, 150%. When you're going to 200 or 300% of the economy, what you're going to see is the bond market can't supply that much lending at plausible interest rates. And that's when you get the debt and interest spiral. And that's why I'm watching interest rates closely, because when interest rates start to rise because they can't supply the debt, you get the spiral. I'm not saying that we're going to have a debt crisis next year, but it could be 10 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 20 years. Either way, the economists at the University of Pennsylvania tried to project out the debt over the next 30 years. The economy over the next 30 years. They couldn't even project out a functioning economy under the current debt projections. So something is going to happen during the next 5, 10, 20 years. We just don't know when, unless we fix it.
So if you were to, say this to one of your old colleagues, a Republican senator or Republican congressman, wouldn't they say something like, well, yes, but you know what? We can grow ourselves out of this, right? That yes, there's the numerator and the denominator. And if we just grow the economy fast enough and big enough, then this won't be that big a problem. Isn't that the go-to answer?
That is the go-to answer. I brief members of Congress. I brief Republican members of Congress all the time. And the answer is we'll just grow our way out of it.
Yeah. Right.
Well, first off, even if we did grow the economy faster, it would only save a few $100 billion a year out of deficits in the trillions, in part because while faster economic growth increases revenues, it also automatically increases Social Security payments, which are based on wages. It increases Medicare payments, which are based on healthcare consumption that rises with income. And growth also generally raises interest rates, which makes the interest cost bigger on the debt. So you do get some savings, but only a couple $100 billion. But the bigger problem with saying we're going to do this with economic growth is I'm not really sure how. You see, economic growth is the product of productivity growth and the growth of the labor force. When the economy was growing so well in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was mostly because of more women entering the workforce and the boomers entering the workforce. Well, right now, the labor force is on course to stagnate and begin declining a decade from now due to low fertility, retiring baby boomers, and immigration restrictions. If the labor force isn't growing, well, you would need productivity growth to double to meet the expectations of the Republicans in Congress. I don't think we can necessarily assume productivity will double.
I actually understood that as a non-economist. In fact, I remember a few years ago, back here in Wisconsin, I heard a presentation about what you need to grow an economy in a healthy way. And one of the key things was population growth. And this was, I think part of this is why we need immigrants, why we encourage immigration. It does seem that people in the administration on the right understand the need to get the birth rate up, right? I mean, that they are trying to encourage that.
Yes.
But does the math add up? Can you raise the birth rate enough to compensate for a dramatic loss of, say, immigrants, just simply population, people paying into these programs?
Not at all. I mean, because even if you can increase the birth rate, those individuals aren't going to enter the workforce for 20 years. They're not going to produce their peak productivity years for 40 or 50 years. So you need the birth rate to rise over the long term, but in the short term, you have the deportations, the wall, and I know immigration is a big cultural touchstone for a
Yep,
lot of
right.
people. But if you look at it from a pure economic perspective,
Right.
mass deportations, which will actually reduce the size of the labor force is going to hurt the economy because again,
Hmm.
if the labor force isn't growing, now you need productivity to double. I don't think you can assume that. I see a lot of Republicans who say, we want to grow the economy like we did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to have to give us the labor force population growth of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They don't want to do that.
Well, of course, this raises also the question of international trade and the tariffs. Interestingly enough, conservative Republicans have been anti-tariff for a very long time. Ronald Reagan was actually very, very eloquent about why this was not a good idea,
Yes.
and now it appears to be at the very, very heart of conservative populist economics. I just want to back up a bit though, because we know where the political and the political, I think, juice behind the tariffs came from. This sense that globalization hollowed out the American economy, that it contributed to the deindustrialization of the American economy. I remember years before Trump came on the stage, I remember speaking at a group, and it was a I'm trying to remember what it was. I want to say lathe operators, but it was something slightly different. And one of the themes was that how China was stealing all of the jobs. So I guess the first question is: was neoliberalism and globalization a success or a failure that led us to this moment we're in right now? I'm sorry, that's a big question, but
It's a qualified success. When I say qualified success, we want all of the benefits of globalization. We want low inflation. We want to go to the store and see tons of products on the shelves.
yeah.
And we want good jobs in America. And the jobs we have added in export industries, the agriculture sector has done very well. Export sectors, technology,
Hmm.
software, so many sectors have done well. But there was an estimate about 10 years ago, I believe, by the Federal Reserve that said that globalization has raised family incomes by about $10,000. And when people talk about manufacturing job loss, well, we have lost manufacturing jobs, but it's not because of free trade or NAFTA. It's because of productivity growth. The
Hmm.
manufacturing job loss goes way before NAFTA. It starts in the late 1970s, early 80s, because we were able to become more productive. We were able to bring computing technology into manufacturing. That would have happened even without China and NAFTA. That's something a productive economy can do. Now, I say qualified success because obviously it produced a political backlash. People didn't see the low prices, the higher incomes as the result of globalization, but they did see the
Hmm.
factory that closed down the
They,
street.
they did,
And I
right.
think we could have done a better job in this economy of taking care of the people who lost their jobs, taking care of the people whose factories had closed, not turning our back on globalization, but taking into account the fact that the economy doing better doesn't necessarily mean that 55-year-old with a high school diploma who worked in a factory 30 years is better. Perhaps if we had done a better job taking care of the individuals, we could have avoided some of the backlash.
Well, I mean, but it's not simply an argument marketing issue because as you're a Midwesterner, as you drive through Michigan, if you drive through Ohio or Wisconsin, you'll drive through towns that used to be thriving, Midwestern middle class communities that are just, I mean, ghost towns. I mean,
Yeah.
where they have been hollowed out, where the factories, the businesses that used to be there on Main Street are gone, and you could certainly make a plausible case that, yeah, globalization lifted the overall economy,
Mhm.
but it had a devastating impact in particular areas, which, by the way, you can now see on the electoral map.
Absolutely. And, manufacturing has, the loss of manufacturing jobs has absolutely hurt a lot of towns in the upper Midwest. I'm from Appleton, Wisconsin.
Yes.
We've lost manufacturing jobs. Kaukauna has lost manufacturing jobs, which
Mm-hmm.
is kind of near Appleton. Menasha, which is near Appleton, has lost
Yeah.
manufacturing jobs.
Know them
Although in the
well.
South, manufacturing jobs have jumped. So a lot of it, too, has been a redistribution from the North to the South of manufacturing jobs, which again is no consolation to the people who lived in
No.
Kaukauna, Wisconsin all their life and didn't move to the South to take advantage because their roots are up here. And so, I think, again, the challenge is we want the benefits of
Yeah.
globalization. We want
We do
low
want the benefits.
prices. We want wide selection of items at Walmart. We want rising incomes. We want export jobs. We're going to have to deal with some of the redistributive aspects of globalization. But I think going backwards on it and building a wall around the country is not the answer. I
Well,
think
okay.
that's only going to, you can't go back to that, especially again when productivity was driving the manufacturing job loss more than globalization.
Well, you wrote this piece a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago. Trump's tariffs are incoherent and destructive. So let's talk about this. Donald Trump has this, this grand plan. What do you mean? Why are they incoherent and destructive? I mean, I know the answer, but I want to hear a much more intelligent answer than I would give.
Well, I don't really know what the tariffs are meant to accomplish.
Hmm.
If they're meant to bring home manufacturing jobs, remember Howard Lutnick said we're going to have American fingers putting the
Oh my God.
screws in the iPhones.
Yeah.
Of course, no one's volunteered for that job. If they're meant to bring back manufacturing, then why is Trump constantly turning the dials and then saying, well, actually, this was the art of the deal. We're doing this for global trade concessions. Well, ultimately, we haven't really gotten any global trade
Mm,
concessions. We are not bringing back manufacturing jobs because that's not really how tariffs work. And
mm,
businesses don't have the certainty about where trade policy is going. So you're not bringing back manufacturing, but you're also not really getting any better trade deals either, because other countries haven't made major concessions. Similarly, Trump has said we're going to get rid of imports, but we're also going to raise enough tariff revenue to get rid of the income tax.
Oh yeah.
Well, not only is that mathematically impossible, but these two ideas contradict each other. If there is no imports to tax, then how are you going to raise all the money through tariffs? And ultimately, we're raising almost no money so far from the tariffs on the net. And so ultimately, we're hurting the economy. We're hurting manufacturing, which is the industry we're supposed to be sacrificing everyone else to help. We're not raising much money. We're creating uncertainty. I just don't know what they're even meant to accomplish right now.
So, do you get the sense, though, that he's blinking? It was just last week that he backed off of the 145% tariff on China. I don't know. You follow this more closely than I do. I was not able to find anything that China really gave up. So, is Trump blinking? And also, he announced over the weekend that, having promised 90 deals in 90 days, that he was just going to be sending out strongly worded letters because he doesn't have time to
Yeah.
actually do the thing. He's going to tell people what their tariffs are. So, what is the state of play, do you think?
The big win we had is that when we lowered some of our tariffs, China lowered some of their retaliatory tariffs. But
Yeah.
both sides' tariffs are still higher than they were before we started. So ultimately, we've gotten nothing. I will say, of course, Trump blinked. It was at the moment when the stock market had dropped 20%, the bond market was starting to panic, the economy actually shrank in the first quarter. That's when Trump announced the 90-day pause. And of course, we know how Trump does this. It's the same thing with Canada and Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
He finds some very minor concession he can point to that was no big deal and that we could have gotten in 5 minutes anyway, and says, aha, this was my victory all along. This is what I wanted. I'm declaring victory. But the state of play right now is, I think, a certain degree of policy paralysis in regards to the negotiations. Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick are always saying we're going to work out all these deals, but when they're interviewed on the Sunday morning shows and they're asked what deals have been made so far, we're told, well, we're just beginning discussions. So I'm not really sure that the Trump administration has the competence, the attention span, or the interest of getting into these weeds. And we may just end up with Trump kind of turning the dials like a madman over the next 4 years, raising tariffs up or down depending on his mood or depending on what the
Whim.
trade deficit is.
No, I think that is very plausible. So, what did you make of his comments, which I thought were rather extraordinary? That well, maybe people don't need $30; they only need $2. You don't need 250 pencils; you only need 5 pencils. I mean, I'm trying to imagine if Barack Obama would have said something like that, or Kamala Harris would have said something like that. Basically, sitting here in Washington, I have decided exactly how much you people out there need to live with. And of course, being lectured by Donald Trump, this avatar of excess, being
Yes.
lectured on our need to cut back and live with more austerity. Not even Jimmy Carter in the Cardigan would have gone after dolls. So what was your reaction when you heard that?
Very similar to you, the gall, essentially.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Bernie Sanders had said things like this.
I know. He had literally.
Conservatives for years have made fun of Bernie Sanders for saying we have too many options. We shouldn't have so many options at stores. And again, coming from Donald Trump, who, again, as you said, the avatar of excess, basically saying, let them eat cake to everyone else. I have all of these mansions and billions of dollars, but your kid can only have 2 dolls.
And these free planes.
It's galling, but it's interesting because Trump's entire political brand has been, I may be a jerk, but I'm the deal maker that's going to make you rich. And it's very odd to see him going from the avatar of excess, who's going to make, I'm going to make you rich as rich as I am, to, economic growth isn't that important. You don't need to have these things. He sounds like Bernie Sanders, and that's so different from his brand. And I think ultimately that's part of the reason he caved when the stock market was going, because Donald Trump doesn't know how to sell sacrifice. Democrats are used to selling sacrifice. Trump sells excess. And the idea that he was going to have to sell sacrifice and a declining stock market and rising prices, I don't think it works for his brand. And as bad as he is on policy, he's got a pretty effective political antenna to realize this isn't going to work for his brand. And that's why it was the stock market and the bond market that eventually got his attention.
So I think this is a really important point. I mean, to grossly simplify it, I mean, his appeal in the campaign is basically, safety, prosperity, and revenge. I'm going to keep you safe. I'm going to make you all rich. You're all going to get, benefit from this golden age. And this was very, very much off. Okay, I want to get to the budget in just a moment, but
Right.
his attack on Walmart over the weekend. The Walmart CFO came out and said, "Look, 30% tariffs on China. Yeah, it's going to make things more expensive." There's a story out now, that Target is also being slammed, and people are going to see it. And Trump puts out this bleat attacking Walmart for saying this. Don't you dare, because I want you to, his phrase, eat the tariffs. Eat the tariffs. It used to be eat the rich. Now it's eat the tariffs.
Eat the tariffs. I was personally very confused by this because Trump's been telling me for half a year that China pays the tariffs.
Yes.
And that none of the Americans are going to pay anything. So why would Walmart need to eat a tariff if they don't raise prices, if China eats the whole thing? Well, obviously that's not how the economy works. Of course consumers pay the tariffs. And asking Walmart and Target to shave their pretty modest profit margins. Walmart's profit last quarter was 2.7%. They don't have massive profit margins to eat tariffs. And even if they did, why would a business do that as a favor to a politician?
Yeah.
So now you have Donald Trump sounding like Elizabeth Warren talking about greedflation. The reason prices are rising is because Walmart's greedy, Target's greedy, Amazon was going to be greedy, but he threatened them out of it. And this is another area where it's horseshoe theory in action. Trump is talking like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. The populist MAGA base is eating it up. And free market Reaganites like me are just baffled.
It is baffling. Okay, let's switch, and this would be like even just as baffling. Congressional Republicans working on this reconciliation bill. I just assume at some point they're going to get the deal done because they always do. What do moderate Republicans do? They cave in.
Yes.
They can't afford to lose any votes. So this some version of this is going to pass. It's going to be messy, but they're going to do it. You wrote a few weeks ago, congressional Republicans might set off the debt bomb. We talked about the debt bomb a little bit earlier, but this is their big, beautiful bill. How will they set off the debt bomb?
The cost of this bill is enormous. If you take away the fake expiration dates in the bill, and we know they're fake because they're currently canceling the expiration dates for this December right now. So if you take away the fake expiration dates, the tax cuts are $6.2 trillion over 10 years. To put that in context, that is bigger than the 2017 tax cuts, the 2020 CARES Act pandemic, Biden's 2021 American Rescue Plan stimulus, and the Inflation Reduction Act combined. It's bigger than all four of those combined. This would be the most expensive piece of legislation since the 1960s. And we're doing it at a time where the deficit's already $1.8 trillion. If they pass this, I think the deficit probably exceeds $4 trillion a decade from now, even under peace and prosperity. And I had mentioned earlier that the bond market and interest rates are the canary in the coal mine. That's where we're going to see a debt crisis begin. And we're seeing the bond market already starting to panic. The 10-year is at 4.5%. The 30-year is over 5%. Again, anything over 4%, you're looking at eventually a debt spiral. The fact that the bond market is starting to cry uncle, we've been downgraded. You would think cooler heads will prevail, but as you mentioned, the moderate deficit hawk Republicans' main role is to be very disappointed in the deficit impact of a bill right before they vote for it.
Right. Okay, so when you explain that, just the way you did to me, when you explain that to Republicans on Capitol Hill, what is their reaction? Because in theory, they are Republicans because this is exactly the thing they don't want to do. So what do they say to you?
I have this conversation with Republicans every day. They say two things. Number one, spending is the problem. To which I say, great, where is the spending cuts? Oh, no, don't worry about taxes. Spending is the problem, which would matter if they actually did anything on spending.
Yeah.
I don't think the spending cuts in this bill are going to pass at all. The second thing they make is, as you suggested earlier, we're going to grow our way out of this.
Yeah,
we're going to double or triple the economic growth rates, and we're going to grow 4 or 5%. Of course, there's nothing in this bill that would create economic growth that fast. Most of the bill is just keeping tax policy where they are today, except the pro-growth stuff like business expensing is just temporary. And they're adding things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime that don't really provide growth. But that's what they tell you. They say spending is the problem and we'll grow our way out of it, even though they actually have no blueprint to cut spending and no plan to increase growth.
Okay, so there is a certain political logic in all of this. I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying, but in Trump's mind, he's thinking, okay, I can get away with the tariffs and the increased costs and all of this deficit because I'm giving away goodies to key constituencies, like no taxes on tips. Does not grow the economy, but look, I mean, it's going to be nice
The
if you live
giveaway.
on tips. If you they want to don't they want to make interest payments on car loans
Or
tax
yes.
deductible, which is okay. That's kind of a giveaway. Tax free overtime. So it's a little bit like Banana Republic economics. Why here's a goodie for you, here's a goodie for you, here's a
Yep.
goodie for
It's
you,
buying off
and
every interest. It's buying off
right.
voters.
And they will
Absolutely.
all expire right before the next election. So if you don't vote for me, you don't keep your goodie. And he wants people to focus on their goodie as opposed to the macro issue, which may not be politically stupid.
No, and this is what works. I mean, look, I care about the deficit. Almost nobody else does.
No,
I mean,
right.
the reality is, this isn't the 80s and 90s anymore, where the voters were concerned about deficits and lawmakers were expected to show how they would pay for their policies. Today, voters want Santa Claus. They want someone to just give them a handout, and Republicans will just shrug it off and say, oh, we'll just cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and we'll pay for the whole
Right.
thing.
But they've been saying
Pretty
that for
similar
50
to
years.
Democrats who say we can
Yeah.
increase spending as much as you want and we'll just tax the rich. The thing is, not only do the numbers not add up, but those savings policies never come. But that's ultimately where they're at politically, and it works because we're the voters and we're to blame, and we don't care either. We want the government to play Santa Claus.
So you wrote a piece, "The 10 Worst Republican Budget Gimmicks." I assume that some of them are still in, all of them are still in. What's your favorite budget gimmick?
I mean, one of my favorites is the current policy baseline, where Republicans pass a tax cut and they keep the cost down by saying it's only going to last for a couple of years. Don't worry, we're
Right.
not blowing up the deficit. It's only going to pass for a few years. And then at the end, when a few years are up, they just get rid of the expiration date and
Sure.
say, don't worry, the rest of the cost is free because we're not changing tax policy. We're just extending current policies, which means those big extensions are never accounted for. They're not accounted for.
So you're saying that, okay, so when we're talking about a $4 to $5 trillion increase in the debt, are you saying it could be much, much bigger if we assume
I'm saying,
that
6.2 trillion. If you get rid of the expiration dates, which Republicans say are fake anyway, it's really $6.2 trillion over 10 years.
So is there anyone on Capitol Hill in either party that, in your view, is talking sense, actually wants to solve these problems that we've been discussing?
Again, I think we have a lot of deficit hawks. I'm putting air quotes, deficit hawks, who will give a lot of speeches on the House floor. They'll give a lot of press conferences, and then they'll go vote for the bills. And so I don't want to point out any individuals until I see them vote no on one of these bills. I mean, I know Chip Roy has been very vocal. Thomas Massie has been very vocal. It's frustrating because I talk to these Republicans every day, every week, and they know it's unsustainable, and they know it's not affordable, and they know it's irresponsible. But what they tell me is, it's the politics. If I vote no, my career is over. So I'm just going to hope that I'm not in office when the bill comes. I think you have a lot of lawmakers who get it, but they just don't have the courage to actually stand up. They don't want to risk their career on this.
It's a little bit like, telling people, hey, by the way, you know that the sun will explode in 6 billion years? And they'll say, well, that's not my problem, as I'll be dead by then. The reaction is often the same. Hey, we're going to have this massive debt explosion. We might not be able to pay all the Social Security, obligations in 2035. And they're thinking, hey, maybe I'll be dead by then, or maybe I'll be out of office, right? I mean, it's like, wait, this is a little bit sooner. And 2035 is not as far away as 6 billion years, is it? Just
no, if you're retiring into Social Security today, you're going to be in your mid 70s when the Social Security Trust Fund goes belly up. This is going to be you if you're retired today. It's coming.
Well, and that, I think, will, you want to talk about a debt crisis, that will be a political crisis, and, talk about when that crunch comes. Jessica Riedl, thank you so much for all of your time. Jessica is at the Manhattan Institute, and you can read her stuff, well, pretty much everywhere, because you are prolific. You are on social media. You have written hundreds of studies. So we'll look for you in the Atlantic, the Manhattan Institute. And again, thank you so much for your time, Jessica. I appreciate it very much. Always a treat to talk with a fellow cheesehead.
Go Packers, go Brewers, go Badgers.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. You know why we do this? Because now, more than ever, and probably for the next 4 years, it is absolutely crucial that we remind ourselves that we are not crazy ones.